Hey everybody, today's lesson is going to focus on slavery in the United States from the time of the Revolutionary War uh, through about the outbreak of the Civil War. And our objectives are to, number one, explain the rise of cotton cultivation and how it affected the society and economy of the Old South, look at the major social classes that segmented the Old South, and then evaluate the causes, actions, and results of the early abolitionist movements. And so I want to get started by just talking about really a repeat of what we've been talking about earlier, how slavery was in a period of decline during the Revolutionary era. Um, the Revolutionary War and the emphasis on Enlightenment ideals led to emancipation in several northern states. Some states, such as Massachusetts, actually emancipated their slaves in 1780. Others, such as New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, are going to gradually emancipate their slaves. So kind of balancing those their rights and black civil rights with white property rights. And the revolution itself actually garnered support from many slaves. Although the British offered African Americans who were in slavery a better deal than the American army, there were still 10,000 African Americans, mainly from Virginia, that volunteered for the Revolutionary War and were granted manumission or freedom. And what this actually led to in the whole Chesapeake area, this led to, on one hand, a growing commitment to liberty among Southern planters that they would, emancipate their slaves, and several did. We're going to see a further decline of slavery during the 1780s in the Chesapeake region. However, there was also great resistance against it. Even Thomas Jefferson, on behalf of other planters, sent petitions that argued slavery was a necessary evil, and it was required to maintain the lifestyle that existed. And so, despite the fact where we have this one movement where it's pushing for further emancipation of the slaves in the South, we're also going to see a resistance to that manumission. Regardless, most of our founding fathers did believe it was a dying institution. It was expensive to maintain. It was expensive to maintain. It was economically risky, and so they felt it would be dying pretty soon anyway. However, the invention of the cotton is really going to change all that. Like I said, prior to 1793, the Southern economy was weak. There were depressed prices. They had soil-ravaged lands, and the slave system itself was economically risky. Once again, they believed it was going to die out, but with the invention of the cotton gin, we're going to see a massive change. And if you look at this chart, it kind of shows you the increase in cotton production from 1800 through 1860, and then also the maps correlate where the large slaveholding populations were in 1790 versus 1860. The cotton gin made cotton picking 50 times, not 50%, but 50 times more effective, and resulted in just an explosion of the cotton industry. And cotton came to surpass tobacco and rice in the Southern economy. Cotton also drove the Northern economy as well. The prosperity of both the North and the South really rested upon the cotton industry, which rested on slave labor. And Britain was dependent on cotton as well. As far as trade goes, 80% of the world's cotton came from the southern United States. Additionally, 57% of all American exports were cotton. So, the whole economy, despite the fact that the North was becoming more industrialized, the whole economy was dependent upon cotton. I have here just a couple of maps. This shows you some of the major cotton production areas by 1820 after the first cotton boom. But after 1820, another cotton boom ensued, and see the development of cotton in these areas, particularly going through Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. Furthermore, these maps correlate the distribution of slaves. If you look at this first map here, and you look, in the area, the Chesapeake area, which is right over here, you see that area which grew tobacco. You see coastal South Carolina, the rice. Those are the big slave areas. However, by 1860, it extended further westward and continued to extend during that time, and continued to extend with the growth of plantations. With that said, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the internal slave trade as well. As you probably remember, the slave trade was banned in 1808 as a result of the Constitutional Convention, but that didn't stop the vibrant slave trade. And most historians agree that to be enslaved had multiple horrific aspects, and the two most pressing would be the physical uh, subjugation by slaves, either the beatings or b, the rapes that occurred, but then also the psychological horror. And some actually the psychological horror was even greater than the beatings. The fact that families could be separated, slave marriage vows included the fact till death or distance do us part. And the fact that, if you look at this advertisement, you see that they were treated as property, being sold with land and corn and other property. Furthermore, and so we'll see this internal slave trade within this country that does continue. This also shows the inhumanity of slavery. This was basically a mixed race slave who was being raffled for a chance at $1 each. And once again, you see this whole idea of slaves as property, this idea of chattel slavery that continued on in the South, in particular. Going on, we can also divide the South. Not all Southern slave systems were the same, and the experiences were very different. And so there's some major generalizations about slavery. Generalization number one: the further north, the cooler the climate, the less commitment to slavery. Generally, the more free blacks would be in the further north, and African Americans as less percentage of the population. The further south, the higher the commitment to maintaining slavery, and the larger amount of population, almost half and half African American and white. Okay. Second big generalization about the South. The South was, although it was diverse between European whites and African Americans, the white population was not very diverse. Very few immigrants came to the South. Indeed, I think it was maybe 7% of the immigrants that actually came to the South from Europe, whereas the majority, 90%, went throughout the northern states or the northwestern states. So we don't really see, it's really the most Anglo-Saxon region of the country. As far as the three Souths, you have first your border Souths. This would include the states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. In the border South, like I said earlier, for the most part, during the Civil War, Unionists would overcome the disunionists. Slaved by the Civil War is about 17% of the population. Maybe 22% of white families owned slaves. The Middle South, you have the tobacco state of Virginia, and then you have North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And these states, compared with 21% of, compared with 22% of white families owned slaves. In this area, 36% of white families owned slaves as well. And 30% of the population were slaves. The Deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, had a larger commitment. Almost 44% of white families owned slaves. And of all those that owned 20 or more slaves in the South, 62% were in the Deep South. This was the cotton plantations that were prevalent. This is where cotton was king. These 7 states grew probably 95% of the South's cotton and almost all the sugar, rice, and indigo in this country. And with that, we're going to see, this change. So once again, we have your border South, your mid-South, and your deep South. The slave system in the South also took on a name known as the peculiar institution. And I always found this kind of an interesting thing. On one hand, it was very difficult for many of the slave owners to actually call it slavery. They made rationalizations for it. And peculiar institution, as far as a system goes, it kind of went with it. But the South was really dominated by this, what we call this planter aristocracy. By 1850, there were 1,733 families that owned more than 100 slaves. And these families dominated Southern politics as well. The South was the least democratic region. There was a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and these planter aristocrats who dominated politics, they didn't care much about public education. They sent their kids to private schools. It's one of the reasons the South remained one of the most illiterate parts of the nation during this time period. This planter aristocracy also wanted to carry on the cavalier tradition of early Virginia. They had a lot of military academies. They almost idolized the old feudal period in Europe with the lords and the ladies. Their elite and culture included, dueling and chivalry, and this old system that ensued. As far as the plantation system, it was somewhat economically risky. Slaves could die of disease, they could injure themselves, they could escape. And furthermore, the one-crop economy discouraged diversification of agriculture and discouraged manufacture in the South. Southerners, on one hand, wealthy Southerners weren't really to change or diversify their economy, but they were also resentful that the North and Northern bankers were making huge profits at their expense. They resented being dependent on the North, but once again, they really made no effort to change because they were making so much money through the cotton system as well. And as far as plantation slavery and the burdens, there were nearly 4 million slaves by 1860. Even though the legal import had ended by 1808, there was a huge increase due to just natural reproduction. Owners often rewarded slave women for multiple children, and white slave owners often fathered sizable mixed-race populations who often remained enslaved. Thomas Jefferson being your best example of that. He and Sally Hemings had several children together. Slaves were also seen as, valuable assets, primary source of wealth. Like I said, the burdens, we talked about the physical burdens. Punishment was often brutal, and it was used to intimidate slaves not to defy master's authority. While it was not common, it was not uncommon for unruly slaves to be whipped publicly. Furthermore, rape was often another physical abuse that occurred during this time period of female slaves during this time by a lot of the slave owners. In addition to physical punishment, like I said, the auctions themselves were one of the most revolting aspects of slavery as well. Families were often separated. They could be divided as property. They could be divided if a planter was bankrupt. And it was really probably the greatest psychological horror that existed during that time period. Yet despite this oppression, a very vibrant African-American slave culture developed. They became Christian through religion and so forth. There were also several slave revolts that existed, but none of the slave revolts were as big as Bacon's revolt. The two that are probably the most important would be the Stoner Rebellion and Nat Turner's revolt. The Stoner Rebellion actually occurred during the colonial period, and the Stoner Rebellion occurred in coastal South Carolina. Slaves fled toward Florida, killing whites along the way. They did not make it. In fact, many were captured. They were hung, bodies displayed to discourage any future revolt. But what it did do, it actually led to more oppressive slave codes and a more oppressive slave system during the colonial era. Two other rebellions that are significant, but not as significant as the Stoner Rebellion or Nat Turner's were Prosser's Revolt and Vesey's Revolt. Gabriel Prosser was a slave blacksmith in Virginia. He planned a military slave revolt. He actually recruited 150 men, but the rebellion never materialized, and in fact someone basically informed on them, and Prosser and 26 others were hung. 1822, Denmark Vesey led a similar rebellion in Charleston. It was supposed to be the largest ever, although it never materialized, and once again a slave informer advised his master of the plot. Vesey and 30 others were hung. The most significant rebellion of the 19th century, though, was Nat Turner's Revolt in 1831. This revolt actually led to a wave of killing that basically slaughtered 60 white Virginians, mostly women and children. And this wave of killing actually slowed down the revolt's aim of capturing a local armory. This was the largest slave revolt ever in the South, and in response to it, over 100 slaves, including Turner, were hanged and displayed. More significantly, Nat Turner's revolt produced a wave of anxiety among Southern planters. This resulted in harsh laws that clamped down further on the slave institution. Slave codes increased. For example, it was a crime to allow your slaves to read or write and to be literate. And it increases Southern white paranoia. I have to also mention that during this time period, there was also the beginnings of a lot of abolitionist propaganda coming into the South, which also further intensify this white paranoid behavior. And so we'll talk more about this and justifications for slavery in our next unit. Moving on, I do want to also talk about the white majority in the South and how the South existed. So talked about the Southern white paranoia, but about 1/4 of all white Southerners owned slaves, which meant that 3/4 did not. 2/3 of all slave owners owned less than 10 slaves each. But like I said, that power really rested in those 1733 families. I also need to point out, though, that 75% of white Southerners owned no slaves at all. And some of these were the most poor, amongst the most poor people in the South. Planters looked down upon these mostly subsistence farmers. They were located in the backcountry. They raised maybe corn and hogs. The poorest of the poor were often called white trash or hillbillies or crackers or clay eaters by the planter class. They suffered from malnutrition. They had parasites. And interestingly, these poor Southerners were some of the fiercest defenders of the slave system. Many respects, it's psychological. They took comfort knowing that they were not the lowest of the low. And it was almost like one of their dreams that one day they too could own a slave as well. And slavery in many respects proved effective in not just only controlling blacks, but controlling these poor white Southerners and keeping them against, keeping them in support of this system that also kept them in poverty. There was also a small minority of mountain whites. These lived in the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, including East Tennessee and Western Virginia. They were mostly independent, small farmers that really located far from the Cotton Kingdom. They lived in a pretty rough environment. They generally hated the wealthy planters, but they also hated the slaves. During the Civil War, however, most became Unionist, and they were significant in crippling the Confederacy. As far as African Americans that were free in both the North and the South, they numbered about 250,000 in each region. Once again, if you're looking at your South, the further north in the South and the border South, there were more free blacks than there were in the deep South. Many were able to buy their freedom from earnings they earned from labor after hours. Some owned property. You probably heard that there were actually some African Americans who owned slaves. While this is true, it was very rare. You can probably count the numbers on two hands, but it did exist. And there was discrimination in both the North and the South. In the South, free blacks were prohibited from certain occupations. They were prohibited from testifying against whites in court and always in danger of being forced back into slavery by slave traders. In the North, some states forbade them, entrance or denied them public education. Some segregated blacks in public facilities. There was especially increased antagonism between free blacks in the North and the Irish immigrants that were coming over in the 1840s. Often the two groups competed for jobs, and there was actually racial riots during the 1860s during the Civil War in New York City, aimed by the Irish, aimed against the African American community as well. And with that said, I want to talk a little bit about the abolitionist movement as a whole. And going up through the 1830s, the abolitionist movement was not as mainstream. In fact, early during the revolutionary eras, some of the enlightened thinkers began to push for the idea of freeing the slaves. But really, the Quakers were pretty much the only organized group that specifically, pushed for the abolition of slaves during that time period. Okay. One of the first bigger groups, by the way, as a result, we will see early emancipation in the North. I think we talked about this earlier. And we'll see, the northern New England states emancipate by state constitution. And the red states, so those middle states, by gradual emancipation. What that would mean is, for example, if someone was born a slave, they might die a slave, but their children could be freed. One of the first groups founded in 1817 that was opposed to slavery and sought a practical solution was a group called the American Colonization Society. This was a small group. It didn't have a large following, but they were generally common. They believed in many of the same ideals others did. On one hand, they believed that slavery was a moral wrong and that slaves should be freed. On the other hand, they also believed that blacks and whites could not live together, and so they advocated the idea of sending the freed slaves back to Africa. And in fact, the country of Liberia was created in 1822. The capital was Monrovia, named after President James Monroe, and 15,000 freed blacks were transported from the United States to Liberia over the next few decades. One of the big problems is that many freed blacks just didn't want to go there as well. And they saw themselves as American. And so the movement never really took off. There was just too much opposition to it for it to actually work in the way this group wanted to work. By this point, most African Americans had been born, in America and part of America's growth and culture and wanted to remain so as well. By 1860, virtually all Southern slaves were native-born Americans. Another group is going to form in the 1830s, and this is going to be led by a man named William Lloyd Garrison. And so I want to talk a little bit about this. Later on, as we go through this chapter, you're going to learn about the Second Great Awakening, which became this religious reform movement that occurred in the 1820s. This basically led to abolitionism becoming the dominant reform movement. And especially the 1830s, abolitionists were inspired that Britain had freed their slaves in 1833. Of these early abolitionists, probably the most important was William Lloyd Garrison. He published his newspaper, The Liberator, in Massachusetts. It was a militant anti-slavery newspaper. And Garrison actually, his ascent to publishing this paper really kind of symbolized the beginnings of this movement. He actually demanded that the virtuous North secede from the wicked South. Yet he really didn't offer many practical solutions for ending slavery. The North was not about to secede. Many Northerners viewed him as a troublemaker. At one point, he was actually tied to a horse and buggy and dragged around Boston. Regardless, inspired abolitionists did find new societies. The Anti-Slavery Society became more widespread than the American Colonization Society and did not advocate the idea that slaves should go back to Liberia. Other societies will continue to form, and we're going to talk about those societies in the next units. But I do want you to know before we get off here that most of the early abolitionists, were considered radicals. They were not necessarily accepted by the mainstream. That's not going to really change until about the 1850s when a lot of Northerners really begin to question the idea of slavery. Take care, and I'll see you in class on Wednesday.